Thank you very much, Hiba, and thank you everyone for coming this morning to our session. My topic is to address Christianity's historic roots in the Middle East, and particularly Christianity's presence in the world of Islam. So it seemed to me that this very large topic goes way beyond the 30 minutes that I have to speak about it. So how to deal with this particular problem? I thought it would be helpful to look at three particular moments in the history of the Christian communities in the Middle East, and in particular in the world of Islam. I'd like to talk first about how Arabic, after the rise of Islam, became a language of the Christian church, an ecclesiastical language. I'd like to talk, secondly, a little bit about the convivencia of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Baghdad in Abbasid times, from about the middle of the 8th century to the middle of the 13th century. And finally, just a few words about another moment, the history of Christian intellectual life in Cairo in the 13th century. It's obvious, of course, that these three moments are moments in the past, but they speak to the issue of the historic roots of the Christian communities in the Arabic-speaking world, and particularly the Arabic-speaking world of Islam. We all know, of course, that Christianity had its origins in the Middle East, in that part of the Middle East that today we call the Holy Land. We all know that Christianity spread from its homeland northward and westward very quickly. We have the record of this expansion of Christianity in the New Testament itself, particularly in the Acts of the Apostles and the epistles of St. Paul. But what most Western Christians don't seem to realize is that at the same time that Christianity spread northward and westward from the Holy Land into the Greek-speaking and eventually the Latin-speaking world, at that same time, Christianity also spread eastward. And the vehicle of its spreading eastward from its homeland was the Aramaic language that was the language of Jesus himself and, of course, of his first followers, all of whom came from the world of the synagogue, where Aramaic was, of course, a major language at the time. Eventually, Aramaic-speaking Christians carried their faith eastward across Central Asia into Western China, southward into southern India, and of course into the realms of the Arabic-speaking peoples in the territory that today we speak of as Saudi Arabia. It's important, I think, for us to realize that just as the historic languages Greek and Latin tell us the story of Western Christianity, so that dialect of Aramaic called Syriac contains an equal archive of information about the earliest Christian history as it traveled eastward into those territories which I just mentioned. Arabic-speaking peoples who lived in the territory that today is Saudi Arabia, parts of Syria, parts of Iraq, originally learned their Christianity from Syriac-speaking Christians who lived in northern Syria, northern Mesopotamia, in countries today, Turkey, northern Iraq, even parts of Iran. So that by the time Muhammad came to teach and preach in Mecca in the early 7th century, there were already present among the Arabic-speaking communities Christians whose Christianity came into the Arabic-speaking area, as I mentioned just a moment ago, through the Arabic or Aramaic-speaking Syriac Christians. They joined, of course, the already present Jewish community, so that as the message of the Quran was delivered in Arabic, there were Jews, there were Christians already in the audience of the Quran, whom the Quran addresses directly as scripture people, Ahlul Kitab. The evidence for the presence of Jewish and Christian Arabic-speaking peoples in the Quran's original audience is in the Quran itself and in many other places in texts written in Syriac and Greek and other Middle Eastern languages. So my first point is simply to call to mind the fact that when the Quran was first delivered to the Arabic-speaking people, there were already Jews and Christians in its audience. These Arabic-speaking Christians have left no literary heritage behind. But when Islam spread very quickly after the death of Muhammad in the year 632 to gain hegemony over the territories of Palestine, Syria, Iraq, parts of Iran, by the year 650, just 20-some years after the death of Muhammad, large populations of Aramaic-speaking Christian people, Greek-speaking Christian people, inhabited these territories. And very quickly, within 100 years, these people who came to live under Islamic rule learned Arabic, and Arabic thereby became a language of the Christian churches. It's a very interesting study to look into the history of the literature of the Arabic-speaking Christian people after the conquest. These are peoples whose original Christian languages were Greek and Aramaic, Coptic and Armenian, and even Ge'ez, a language in Christian Ethiopia. But all these communities gradually not only learned Arabic in order to function in the new political polity, but were able to turn Arabic, so to speak, into an ecclesiastical language itself. I'd like to tell you about the earliest text written by a Christian in Arabic of which we know. It currently is part of the collections of the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai. It's a text that was written somewhere around the year 750 or so, just 100 years after the Islamic conquest of this area in 650. The text is called by its modern editor a treatise on the triune nature of God. Its own title is lost because the first page of the manuscript is missing. But the very interesting thing about this text, written by a now unknown Christian in Arabic in the middle of the 8th century, is actually not a treatise on the triune nature of God, but it is an effort to explain Christian faith in Arabic terms that reflect the Quran itself. Indeed, the text in its introductory pages is full of phrases from the Quran, allusions to the Quran, and even quotes the Quran among the biblical testimonies in favor of the particular religious points that the author wanted to make. A text like this helps us to see that very early in Islamic times, Christians learned not only to express their faith in Arabic, but to compose the texts that explain their beliefs in language that is designed to speak to the interests and concerns of readers of the Quran, for whom the Quran is a book of revelation. From that point forward, the middle of the 8th century, a great industry of translation of Christian texts into Arabic got underway. Texts of the Bible, texts of the fathers of the church, original compositions. The point to be made is that this enormous body of literature written by Christians in Arabic remains until this day virtually unknown not only to Western scholars, but even to many Arabic-speaking Christians themselves. We know the names of many of the major writers from the several Christian communities of the Middle East who composed hundreds of texts in this Christian language, Arabic. And it's a very important part of our effort to understand the situation in the Middle East today of the Christian communities, to know about their heritage, to know about their literary heritage, to know about their Arabic heritage. So that's the first point that I wanted to share with you this morning, that in our efforts to think about the historic roots of Christianity in the Middle East, it's important to recognize that these historic roots consist of cultural assimilation of the Christian church to a new polity, into a new polity, adopting the language of that polity, making that language their own, coming to a unique and distinctive expression of the Christian faith, which lives to this very day. That's point one, Arabic, the adoption of the Arabic language as an ecclesiastical language by Christians living in the world of Muslims. The second moment in the history of Christians living among Muslims that I would like to highlight this morning has to do with a city, the city of Baghdad. The city of Baghdad was established in the year 767. And everyone knows, of course, that Baghdad is a Muslim city, was founded as a Muslim city. But not everyone seems to realize that Baghdad was, in fact, an interreligious city from the beginning. Established in 767, by the end of the 8th century, Baghdad was already becoming a major metropolis which was attracting interested scholarly people from all over the Islamic world to come there for the sake of study. And not only did Muslim people come to Baghdad to study, so did Jews and Christians. It became an interreligious city. The heads of the Jewish communities, the famous academies in Iraq, moved to Baghdad by the end of the 8th century. The Christian patriarchs of the several Christian communities moved to Baghdad already by the end of the 8th century. So that in the 9th and 10th century, Baghdad actually became a thriving interreligious community in which Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars together created what would become the classical civilization of the Islamic world. That classical civilization to which we historians look back with great interest even to this day. And yet, when the history is written, even today, it's usually written from a single community perspective. So we learn a lot about the Jewish intellectuals of Baghdad, a lot about the Muslim intellectuals of Baghdad and its environs, a little bit only about the Christian intellectuals of Baghdad in this period, and yet they all were working at the same time together in the same city, often interacting with one another. And this is very clear in the historical record. We even find in their texts references to one another. So that when we think of this time in the city of Baghdad, the Abbasid era, the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries in particular, we have a historical instance in the Islamic world of Jews, Christians, and Muslims not only living together, working together, studying together, developing an intellectual life together, which became part of the classical culture of the Islamic world. One can just mention a few names to make the point concrete. We all know, for example, that it was in Baghdad and its environs in the 9th and 10th centuries that the Arabic-speaking world began to develop a great interest in the science and the philosophy of Greeks in particular who lived before them. So there was a translation effort afoot to have in Arabic the works of Aristotle, particularly the logical works, the medicine of Galen, the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus. The translation work was done largely by Christians. And one Christian family in particular, the family of a man called Hunayn ibn Ishaq, was a major translator, he and his family, of these Greek philosophical texts. But the users of these Greek philosophical texts now translated into Arabic from Greek were not just the first Muslim philosophers, people like Al-Kindi, Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, or Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Razi. Not only did these well-known Muslim scholars make use of these translated texts, but so did local Jewish scholars of the time, like, for example, Sadia Hagaon al-Fayyumi, and Muslim scholars like Abu Nasr al-Farabi, and other Christian scholars like Yahya ibn Adi. I mention these names. I'd love to ask how many people in the audience have ever heard of any of these people? Perhaps only of the Jewish scholar Sadia Hagaon. But in fact, the Christians whose name I mentioned, the Muslim philosophers whose name I mentioned, are well-known scholars in the Arabic world who together created a culture, an intellectual culture, a culture of learning that involved all three communities, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, not working together in the sense that they're all working on a single project, but they're all working in Arabic. They're all working in Baghdad. They're all working with the translated texts from Greek and other languages, even Persian languages, and they're writing about very interesting topics. For example, how would you describe a perfect human being? The Arabic expression is al-insan al-kamil. And we find Jewish philosophers, Christian philosophers, Muslim philosophers addressing this topic. Furthermore, how would you construct a functioning, reasonable society made up of people of different religious commitments? This was an interest of the famous philosopher Al-Farabi and of his student Yahya ibn Adi, who was a Christian. And we even find large portions of the work of Saadi Hagaon, the Jewish philosopher of Baghdad, addressing the same topic. So while they're not together trying to compose a single treatise on this topic, they nevertheless are working together in the same language, in the same place, addressing the same topic, struggling to discover how can we best express the truths that we must confess in order to live together in harmony. This is a very important thing, it seems, for us to know that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all participated in a project they all participated in this particular time and place. So, thus far, I've mentioned Arabic becoming an ecclesiastical language as one moment in this important history of Christians in the Middle East. I've discussed Baghdad as a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims could live together, do scholarly work together. This is simply a matter of history. It happened once. It can happen again. But there's an important thing to notice about it. In the days of Baghdad's flourishing, Christians in the Middle East were still demographically a very large group of people. In fact, perhaps even larger than the Muslim community, well up into the 11th and 12th centuries in various parts of the Islamic world. So demographically, there was a strong presence of Christians in the area. And this demography is an important dimension of this living together because it provides social cohesion. It provides the basis for political power for one community to learn to live together with the other. So it's very important, it seems to me, to notice moments like this in the history of the Christians of the Middle East for the sake of the projects that we have in our own day. Finally, in the last several minutes, I'd like to talk about the 13th century in Cairo, the third moment in the history of Christians together with Muslims in the world of Islam. We know, of course, that the city of Baghdad was destroyed in the year 1258 by an invasion of Mongols from the east. Political power, cultural power, intellectual power shifted to Cairo, to Damascus and Cairo in Ayyubid times. And it was in Cairo in the 13th century, in the Coptic community, that a whole generation of very important Arabic-speaking Christian scholars came about and produced an enormous literature that eclipsed the past just in terms of numbers of texts written and numbers of authors composing these texts. We don't have time to list them all here. But there was an important difference. In the Baghdad days, philosophy and theology were the important topics that entertained the thoughts of Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. By the time we get to Cairo in the 13th century, and especially in the 14th century, the topics shift from philosophy and theology in the world of the intellect to legal considerations. The law became the dominant area in which Muslim writers would compose their objections to Christianity, and Christian writers would respond with their defense of their beliefs and practices. And in the wake of this change from philosophy and theology, so to speak, to legal concerns in intercommunal relations, a certain sharpness or harshness entered the conversation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, which had the effect eventually of alienating the communities from one another in a way that had deleterious consequences in subsequent years. We don't have time to go into the specifics of this development, but I wanted nevertheless to mention it, even if very quickly, because my purpose has been to try to highlight the significance of the Christian presence in particular in the world of Islam in the early Islamic period by calling our attention to three specific moments that would turn out to have tremendous consequences in later times. One, Christianity becomes, or Arabic becomes, a Christian language, even a liturgical language. Secondly, the moment of Baghdad, we have an era and a time and a place of Jewish, Christian, Muslim living together in ways that can offer us patterns for what's possible now and in the future. And in the instance of Cairo in the 13th century, we see a moment in which matters begin to diverge in the several communities and in their interests. And we have an era of interreligious polemic that played its role in the gradual diminution of the numbers of Christians in the Middle East. But that's a concern for another day. Thank you very much for your attention.